Hello, art historians, and welcome to, our first lecture over the art of the Americas. So up to this point, we haven't really talked about much about what's going on over in the Americas in North and Meso and South America. So while all of this art is going on in different parts of the world of Afro-Eurasia, there are major things going on over in the Americas as well. And I think it's really important that we take the time to recognize that there was advanced civilization going on over here, and that we have art and architecture to reflect that. So when we talk about art of the indigenous Americas, what they're talking about, naturally, is people who were here first, pretty much, originating probably over migrating from Asia, migrating down across the Bering Strait and working their way down and settling, of course, where it was warmer and more capable of farming. So what's crazy about it is that the American art actually has the world's oldest artistic traditions, aside from what we have discovered and by a tradition, I mean not just creating art, but actually creating a tradition of art or a culture of art that is completely independent or on its own from anything in Europe or in Asia. So it's really important to realize that, we talk about these classical art styles from Europe and Asia, and there would have been classical styles that developed here in the Americas, except a lot of those were eliminated by people who arrived from other places and instilled their culture here. So when we talk about the Americas, it really is divided into geographical regions. So that's kind of the important part to think about, is how they organize American art. So we have ancient America, which is pretty much south of the Mexican border. So that will be Mesoamerican, which is like Middle America, and Andean America, which is South America. And then there's going to be North America, which typically tends to focus on the arrival of Europeans into the present, but that does a huge disservice by not realizing that in North America, there was an artistic tradition going on here. It was just way more functional than it was necessarily decorative. So we're going to see that no matter where the art is in the Americas, there is a huge emphasis on the natural world, which makes sense because they're relying on the natural world. Their environment is very much a part of their survival at this point. They're still very much a farming agrarian culture, unlike other areas of the world that are moving towards more commercial centers. They're very big into the understanding of the cosmic world. All right, so the movement of stars and planets. Basically, they are kind of in the early art that we talked about with Neolithic art. So this understanding of planetary movements, the alignment of the sun, the constant rising of the sun and the rising of the moon, these things that are predictable in a time when life is not necessarily predictable because animals come and go, weather patterns change, but understanding the movement of the stars, the sun, the planets, to them that was a very spiritual thing because that helped them to understand when the seasons were going to change, when to plant, when to hunt certain animals, and gave them a sense of control in a time when things were very uncontrollable and unpredictable. And we have seen that there is shamanistic purposes where certain people had the purpose of communicating with those spirits to make sure that the animals came and the rains came and that the environment was good for farming or hunting. They don't really do art for just art's sake to look at. So kind of like Greek art, which is art to look at. Almost everything that is created was either for public or private viewing or for supernatural viewing, for like spirit viewing, basically as a way to communicate with the other world or communicate with people as a group. And one thing we're really going to see that's a commonality is the importance of mountains, either for functional or religious purposes. Mountains are really going to be a big part of their culture, and the color green is very, very important in American art because it symbolizes water, which can have a greenish appearance, vegetation, corn when it's just starting to grow, all of these things that were very life-giving. So green is going to be a very important color in these cultures. So in North America, which is where we're going to start, so you think of like the border of Mexico northwards, and that can include Canada, is much, much older. And we were talking about parts of the world here where everybody assumes that we pictured the Native Americans on horseback and being very nomadic because that's what the white settlers saw. And the horse wasn't actually native to the Americas. It was actually brought over by Spain. But before that, we did have cultures here that were settled and established large works of art and architecture and were, creating advanced cultures here. But unfortunately, a large deal of that is gone due to the arrival of, Western settlers or people from Europe who settled across this way. So in many ways, a lot of what we have of North America is what remains of what has been destroyed or abandoned. And it leads us to really using archaeology to kind of interpret what these things meant, because we don't have any real understanding otherwise, because the people who created it are unfortunately gone. So North America, I like to call it pre-colonial or pre-contact. We do have evidence of advanced civilizations before the white Europeans show up, but unfortunately a large number of it that's not permanent or large scale has been taken or destroyed by Europeans, particularly ones who are trying to really push Christianity and get rid of what they consider to be pagan traditions as they assimilated Native Americans into their culture. North American art is extremely nature-based, just like we see with every place else. But in North America, instead of Mesoamerican and Andean, so which is South America, there were more servants of nature. Like they were kind of, basically at their mercy, if you would. Where in North America, it's almost like a kinship or a relationship that they had with nature. The spirits work with the humans, work within the humans. And spirits don't live in the objects, whereas in the other areas of the Americas, the spirits could inhabit those pieces. But in North America, it seems to be much more of this, good relationship between people and the natural world. Animal spirits are a very big deal in North America because they believe that animals were around much longer than humans were. So the animals are much closer to their ancestors because animals have always been around. So those animals are much wiser than the actual humans are. And animals are going to be a very prominent theme in North American art. And we've actually seen this in Native American stories where we know that people of leadership often had animal names that kind of reflected their spirit animals. So for example, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, like all of those things were kind of names that reflected your personality and your attributes, and bringing that spirit into yourself to kind of take on those attributes. Everybody, for some reason, thinks this is my spirit animal. I don't know why. May tartar sauce rest in peace. But apparently this is me, according to my students. So whatever. So this is a really good example of that animal spirits and combining with archaeology, because we aren't 100% sure what this actually was for. And you can see from an aerial view looking at this that this is an effigy of a snake mound. All right, so this is actually located in Ohio. All right, and it is the Great Serpent Mound. And what we can see here is that in order for this to be created, there had to have been an organized civilization. There had to have been meaning behind this snake, perhaps a complex religious belief. There had to be the organization to do it. There had to be the organized beliefs behind why they would build such a thing. And so in central North America, we do see a lot of these earthworks. We actually see them in Cahokia Mountains, which is just right across the river from us. So this culture, we believe, is the Mississippian culture because it's kind of in this area. And earthworks, that this is called an earthwork, which you take large amounts of dirt and you kind of pack it all together, and eventually it gets grown over with grass. And you have this serpent effigy, which would actually look now kind of like it's crawling beneath the surface. And this would have obviously led to a very settled civilization to create or want to create something like this, something along the lines of like Stonehenge. So what this does is it definitely shows that relationship between nature and man, because man felt some connection with this snake to create it. And what's ironic is the snake only really starts to take on a negative connotation after Christianity is developed, because we get the idea of the serpent talking to Adam and Eve in the garden and being the one that tempts Eve. But in cultures like Egypt and the Minoan culture, snakes were actually quite helpful because they ate mice and they ate vermin that could destroy crops. So snakes were actually a very good thing, a very thing that's almost be worshipped, in fact. It's 1/4 of a mile long. and it runs along those cosmic directions. So the head is towards the east, the tail is towards the west. And these early cultures would have understood that the sun rises and things begin in the east and they end in the west. So the tail ends in the west. We've seen this with the Buddhist stupa. We know that the gates align towards the four cardinal directions. And these people never would have encountered this. In fact, this was made 1,000 years before the Giza pyramids of Egypt. So the coiled tail and then the mouth open, so possibly eating an oval shaped object in this snake, which could it be an egg, which is the beginning of life? Maybe the snake was the end of life. Maybe it's the eating of the sun. No, we don't know. I mean, we obviously have no evidence of this. There's no written of this. So we have to basically use archaeological evidence to figure this out. There's all kinds of theories about what this could be. Could it be a boundary? Could it be showing the beginning and the end of the seasons, like the solstices? Maybe there was a shadow effect on it. Could it be a calendar? Could it be a compass? We're not 100% sure. But there could be one popular theory, and again, I'm saying a theory because this is along the same lines of what we've seen with like prehistoric art, is snakes shed their skin. So maybe the fact that the skin, is shed of a snake and like surrounded by trees that also shed their leaves, like maybe this is the symbol of the renewing of the seasons or rebirth or a cyclical pattern of the seasons or the rising and the setting of the sun. We're not 100% sure, but it is a plausible theory. And this is just, like I said, another example of earthworks, which these are actually burial mounds in Cahokia, which are not far from where this is. So if you think Missouri and Ohio, not that far apart, could have been along the same lines. Now, we also see this like all over the United States, or what is the United States today. North America was not just advanced civilization in one area. We tend to say that the narrative is that there wasn't really a lot going on in North America prior to the arrival of the West or the Europeans, and that the West was settled by the Europeans, when all actuality we have architectural evidence that shows, and through archaeology we can actually see that there was a very advanced civilization that was located in Mesa Verde in Colorado. So if you move out towards the west, we actually have an area that we do know decided to start farming and create a very advanced civilization. So what we see here is, for them to have settled here, there had to have been some mastery of the environment and irrigation in order to grow these crops. So this was actually built by the ancestral Pueblo people, because they are the ancestors who created these pueblos, and they're called the Anasazi. All right. So what they created is Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. All right. So above this, so this is the bottom of the cliff. On top of the cliff, which would have been green tables. So remember that green importance is, that new life, new growth, new, crops, basically. The Anasazi had originally, from archaeology we've seen, lived on top of this green table on top of this cliff. And then eventually, as that starts to get into competition with other, areas or other people who want those crops and could lead to them being conquered, they moved into the cliffs, possibly for a better defensive position, maybe for better shelter, maybe just because it was a cooler place to live, like in terms of temperature. But they used what they had to build into these natural cliffs. And what we see creating them, and from archaeology we've seen, is these villages grew up over time, where we can see that it started out with small little apartment complexes and then grew into communal areas and a kiva, which could have been used for rituals, signifying that there was a specific religious site built. And when you would come out of this kiva in the ground, you would climb out through this ladder, kind of like emerging from the earth. So like people grow from the earth because they get what the earth grows for them. And these are incredibly large, complex buildings that only somebody who would have lived there, settled around farming, would have built. So for somebody to say that the West was settled by the Europeans is not fair. We have archaeological evidence that shows that at one time there was a very advanced civilization living here. So you can see up above where like the green area would have been. And of course, naturally, it's not there now over time due to irrigation problems and maybe over irrigation, maybe drought, climate change, things like that. We've seen that it was, not so much suitable for farming anymore, but at one time it definitely was. So one of the big questions is okay, well, why is it abandoned? And if you look up here in the top left, you can see that kiva, that central chamber that you could go down to for private rituals and kind of a community area of gathering. So there is a belief that eventually this was abandoned because of overuse. Like they just overused the environment, and eventually it started to kind of, disappear, and not much grew anymore because they overused it. Could have been because they actually did a quite good job growing crops and their population got too big and they had to move on. But we do know what seems to be through archaeological evidence as the people who were the Anasazi moved south into what is today New Mexico and abandoned this area. But we have seen evidence that there was cooking here, there's charred remains on the top, there's artworks across the top. Like this was a home for these people. And you can kind of see where the Anasazi is today. So like Colorado, Mesa Verde is right there. And you kind of see this area, and they would have moved southward afterwards. So you can see here this kiva. There was an area for a fire pit that we've seen that probably would have been the place for rituals. All right, so our next lecture, we're going to move south into Mesoamerica and explore the art of the Aztecs and the Olmecs who were there.